On a cold Tuesday morning in November of 1985, a man named Hudson Lindquist stood under a striped canvas tent in a dusty lot behind the Eddy County Courthouse in Artesia, New Mexico, and bought 320 acres of land that everyone in the county had already agreed was worthless. He paid $4,200 for it. He paid in a cashier's check drawn on the First National Bank of Artesia. He raised his hand exactly one time. The auctioneer called the bid, waited the customary 3 seconds for a counter that never came, and brought the gavel down. Hudson folded the receipt into the inside pocket of his patched wool coat, walked across the gravel to his 1978 Ford pickup, and drove the 41 miles back to his own ranch without saying a word to anyone. He was 48 years old. He had been ranching the same 1,100 acres in the high desert between Artesia and Roswell for 23 years. And he had never in his adult life done anything that the men at the feed store in Artesia would have described as foolish. Let me tell you about that country, because you need to understand the land before you can understand the man. The country between Artesia and Roswell sits in the southeast corner of New Mexico, in a county called Eddy, in the high Chihuahuan Desert at about 3,500 feet of elevation. It is hard country. It is mesquite and creosote and shortgrass grama and rolling caliche flats broken by low ridges of sandstone. It looks like nothing at all to people who pass through it on Highway 285 with their windows up. To the men who ranch it, it is a language with about 40 different words for grass and 12 different words for water. And you live or die out there by how well you read both. Water was the whole thing. Water was the only thing. A section of land in Eddy County with a working well on it was worth 10 times what the same section was worth dry. Because cattle on the high desert can survive on remarkably poor forage if they have something to drink, and they cannot survive on the richest grass in the country if they have nothing. Every conversation in Eddy County eventually came back to wells. Whose was running? Whose had silted up? What the water table was doing east of the Pecos, west of the Pecos, north of Hagerman, south of Loving. A man standing in that country was measured in how many gallons a minute he could pull out of his ground and how clean it came up. And the 320 acres Hudson Lindquist bought that November morning were known throughout the entire county as the deadest piece of dirt anyone had ever tried to sell. The parcel sat on a low caliche bench about 6 miles southeast of Hudson's home place. It had been homesteaded in 1906 by a German family named Holtkamp, who had drilled a well at 68 feet and ranched the parcel for almost 40 years. In 1947, the Holtkamps had rebuilt the casing and put in a new air motor windmill. And for 10 more years, the well had given them clean water at 30 gallons a minute. Then in the late 1950s, the well had gone dry. Not slowly, all at once. One Tuesday in October of 1957, the windmill turned all day and pulled up nothing but a chuffing dry rod. And after 3 weeks of trying everything, the Holtkamps had given up, sold the cattle, sold the parcel back to the county, and moved to El Paso. The land had been on the county tax rolls as a dead parcel ever since. By 1985, the county was selling it for back taxes. The opening bid was $4,200, and there were not supposed to be any bidders at all. Let me tell you about Hudson Lindquist, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did with that ground. Hudson was born in 1937 on the same ranch he was still running in 1985. His father, Lars Lindquist, had come to New Mexico from Minnesota in 1928 with a Swedish farmer's caution and a Swedish farmer's stubbornness, and had bought 1,100 acres of caliche bench when nobody in the county thought it would carry a cow. Lars had drilled 4 wells in his first 10 years. 3 of them had failed. The 4th, sunk in 1936 at 112 feet, on the strength of nothing more than a hunch about a slight darkening in the soil along a dry wash, had produced sweet cold water at 42 gallons a minute for 49 years and was still producing. Hudson had grown up on that water. He had grown up watching his father walk fence lines, reading the country the way a doctor reads a chest x-ray, looking for the small signs that told you what was going on underneath. His father had taught him that the ground does not lie to you, that the ground tells you everything you need to know if you pay close enough attention to it, and that the only people who lose their ranches in the high desert are the people who decide the ground is wrong and they are right. Hudson had buried his father in 1971 and his mother in 1978. He had never married. He ran the ranch alone. He was a small, compact, sun-darkened man who wore the same brown wool coat for 15 years. Not because he could not afford a new one, but because the old one fit him, and he did not see the point of change for its own sake. And the reason Hudson Lindquist bought 320 acres of dead caliche bench that November morning was that he was the only person in Eddy County who knew the well wasn't dead. He had been 20 years old in 1957 when the Holtkamp well failed. His father had been one of the men the Holtkamps had called for help. Hudson had ridden over with his father, had spent 4 days working on the casing alongside old Heinrich Holtkamp and his son Wendell, and he had watched something that no one else who was still alive had watched. He had watched, on the third day, the entire steel casing of the well shift about 4 degrees off vertical when they tried to pull the rod string. Something in the soft caliche underneath the parcel had moved. The casing had not collapsed. It had tilted, and tilted casing in 1957 meant a well that no one had the equipment or the money to fix. So the Holtkamps had walked away, and the well had been called dry. And for the next 28 years, everyone in the county had repeated that the aquifer underneath it had drained out. Hudson Lindquist had said nothing for 28 years. He had not said anything because there had been no reason to. The parcel had not been for sale, and he had a perfectly good well of his own, and no reason to be thinking about a tilted casing under somebody else's ground. But that was not what this story is really about. Educational note. In the American Southwest, water rights and surface ownership have historically been intertwined. A well that has been declared dry is not always physically empty. Sometimes the aquifer is still there, but the equipment to reach it has failed. In high desert regions like southeastern New Mexico, well casings sunk into soft caliche or loose sandstone can shift, tilt, or partially collapse over decades, cutting off the pump from the actual water table. Recasing a failed well was beyond the reach of most family ranchers before the 1980s, when better drilling rigs became regionally available for hire. Part 2. The Quiet Boy and the Gift. Now let me tell you about a 16-year-old boy named Wes Kane, because his arrival in Hudson Lindquist's life is the part of this story where everything starts to mean what it means. Wes Kane came to Artesia in the summer of 1984, the way a lot of kids come to small southwestern towns, which is to say, by accident and necessity, and without any plan worth describing. He had been born in Roswell in 1969 to a Mexican-American mother named Elena Kane, who had worked the lunch shift at a diner on Main Street for 11 years. He had never known his father. His mother had died of pneumonia in February of 1983, when Wes was 14, after working a double shift in a sleet storm and walking home in wet boots. After her death, Wes had been sent to live with his only known relative, a 50-year-old uncle in Hagerman, who drank a fifth of cheap whiskey every night and could not hold a job. Wes had lived in that uncle's mobile home for 14 months. Then on a hot June morning in 1984, he had walked out the door with a canvas duffel bag, walked the 4 miles to Highway 285, and stuck out his thumb. A man hauling alfalfa to a dairy outside Artesia picked him up. The man asked the boy where he was going, and the boy said wherever the truck was going. The man dropped him off at the feed store in Artesia at about 2 in the afternoon. Wes had $7 in his pocket and 1 change of clothes in his bag. He stood in front of the feed store for about 20 minutes and then walked inside and asked the man behind the counter if there was anyone in the country who needed cheap labor for the summer. The man looked at him for a long moment, picked up a phone, and called Hudson Lindquist. Hudson came in the next morning. He looked at the boy without saying much, asked him if he had ever worked livestock, asked him if he could ride. The boy said no to the first and a little to the second. Hudson said that was fine. The boy got in the pickup. They drove out to the ranch in silence. Hudson showed him the bunkhouse, which was a converted tack room with a cot and a kerosene heater. He showed him the corrals and the hay barn. He told the boy he would pay him $6 a day and 3 meals and the bunk room, and that the work would not be easy. Wes stayed. He stayed through the summer of '84 and through that fall and through the cold, dry winter of '84 into '85. He fixed fence. He ran the windmill maintenance, climbing the tower, oiling the head, tightening the sails. He learned to ride passably and to rope poorly and to read the cattle and the country. He did not talk much. He did not need to be told things twice. He had a quality of attentiveness that Hudson noticed in the second week and did not mention for 2 years. The boy could hear a windmill bearing begin to go bad about 6 weeks before anyone else could hear it. He could feel the difference between a well pulling clean and a well pulling silty just by laying his hand on the casing. He had the thing. Hudson did not know what to call it either, but he had grown up watching his father have it, and he recognized it the moment he saw it in someone else. By the autumn of 1985, Hudson had been thinking about the Holtkamp parcel for almost a year. He had ridden over there twice on horseback in the spring, had stood next to the old tilted casing under the broken air motor, and had run the numbers in his head. Recasing the well would cost about $3,500 in 85 money. Rebuilding the air motor head and the sails would cost another $600. The parcel itself would go for whatever the back taxes were, which was $4,200. Total cost, less than $9,000. Total value, if the water came back at anything close to historical flow, was a piece of ground that would carry 200 mother cows year-round. Hudson did not need the parcel for himself. He had his own ground, his own water, his own herd. He was 48 years old and he had no children and no nephew and nobody waiting to take over the place when he was gone. But he had a 16-year-old boy in a converted tack room who could hear a bearing go bad 6 weeks early, and who had the thing. So Hudson went to the auction on a Tuesday morning in November of 1985 and bought the parcel. The next morning, after breakfast in the ranch kitchen, he walked out to the corral where Wes Kane was wiring a broken hinge on the gate, and he handed the boy the deed. Wes looked at the paper. He looked at Hudson. He said, "What is this?" Hudson said, 320 acres southeast of here. Old Holtkamp Place. Wes said, "That's the dead one. Everybody talks about it." Hudson said, "It isn't dead. The well's still there. The casing tilted in 57. We can pull it and reset it." Wes said, "Why are you giving this to me?" Hudson said, "Because you're going to need it." Wes said he could not pay for it, and Hudson said he knew that. And Wes said he did not understand, and Hudson said, "You will." That was the entire conversation. Hudson went back into the house to get his coat. Wes stood by the corral gate holding the deed for a long moment without moving, and then he folded it carefully and put it inside his shirt and went back to fixing the hinge. Because that was the kind of thing you did when somebody had just handed you something you had no words for. Now let me pause here and ask you something. How often, in a whole lifetime, does somebody hand you something they did not have to give? Something that cost them real money and real thought, with no contract and no condition, and no explanation beyond the idea that you were going to need it someday? Not many times. Maybe once. Maybe never. Most people go through an entire 75 years on this earth and never have it happen. Hudson Lindquist handed Wes Kane a deed to 320 acres of dead New Mexico desert on a cold November morning in 1985. And he never asked for a single dollar of it back, and he never mentioned it again. And for the next several years, as far as anybody in Eddy County could tell, it was just a strange thing an old bachelor rancher had done. That was one way to tell it. It was not the most accurate way. Educational note. In 1980s southeastern New Mexico, the transfer of real property through a quitclaim deed required only the signature of the grantor and a county recording fee. There was no requirement of monetary consideration, and a deed could legally be conveyed as a gift between unrelated parties. The transfer became binding the moment it was recorded at the county clerk's office. In rural ranching communities, such transfers were uncommon but not unheard of, particularly between older landowners without heirs and young workers they had come to trust. Part 3. The water comes back. Let me tell you about what Wes Kane did with 320 acres of dead desert between 1986 and the year 2009, because those 23 years are the foundation of everything that comes after. He worked the rest of that winter on Hudson's ranch, drawing $6 a day, saving almost all of it. In March of '86, when the ground softened, he and Hudson rode the 6 miles out to the Holtkamp parcel on horseback, and pulled the rusted hood off the old air motor and looked at the casing. The whole steel pipe was tilted about 4 degrees off true, just the way Hudson remembered it from 1957. Hudson hired a drilling outfit out of Hobbs in May. The drillers came with a flatbed rig and 120 feet of new Schedule 40 galvanized casing and a crew of 3. They pulled the old casing in 2 days. They reset the new one in 3. They drilled 14 feet deeper than the original to clear a sand shelf the Holtkamps had never reached. On a Friday afternoon in the third week of May of 1986, the new well pulled up clear cold water at 72 feet, at 40 gallons a minute, into a galvanized stock tank Hudson had hauled out the week before. Wes was standing next to the casing when the water came up. He did not say anything. He laid his right hand flat on the cold steel of the new pipe and stood there for about 3 minutes. Hudson watched him from 20 feet away and did not say anything either. The water filled the tank, ran over the rim, and started darkening a slow ring of caliche around the base. Hudson finally said it was probably enough for now, and Wes shut the windmill brake, and they drove home in silence. Wes was 17 years old. He had a deed to 320 acres with a working well on it, and he had $418 in saved wages, and he had no idea what he was supposed to do next. What he did next was he kept working for Hudson for another 2 years. He saved every dollar he did not absolutely need to spend. In the spring of 1988, when he was 19 years old, he took a small loan from First National Bank of Artesia, $1,400, and he bought 22 head of Black Baldy yearling heifers at the sale barn in Roswell. He put them on his 320 acres. He continued to live in the bunkhouse on Hudson's ranch and work as Hudson's hand, drawing his wages. And he rode the 6 miles to his own parcel every morning before dawn, and every evening at sundown to check his cattle. He did not make money the first year. He made enough to cover his loan payment and his feed bill and his salt and his fuel, and he put everything else back into the operation. He was 19 years old and he was running cattle alone on a parcel everyone in the county had said was dead, and he was doing it correctly, which in Eddy County in 1988 was not a small thing. By 1991, he had 50 head and had paid off the bank loan. By 1994, he had 90 head. And had built a small adobe block house at the edge of his parcel with his own hands, working on it weekends and evenings for 2 years. The house had 2 rooms and a tin roof and a wood stove and 1 window that looked southwest toward the Sacramento Mountains. And then in the summer of 1994 came the drought that the old men in Artesia still talk about. The summer monsoon failed completely. The grama grass did not come up at all. Half the ranchers in Eddy County had to sell down their herds at giveaway prices in August because their stock tanks were going dry. Wes Kane's well, the supposedly dead well on the supposedly dead parcel, pulled 40 gallons a minute through the entire summer without a measurable drop in flow rate. He carried his 90 head through the drought, sold none of them, and bought 30 more from a desperate neighbor at 12 cents on the dollar in October. By the spring of 1995, he had 140 head. Hudson watched all of this from the same respectful distance he had maintained from the start. He gave advice when Wes asked. Wes asked often, the way someone asks when they have already thought a problem through and wants to check their reasoning against someone older. There were other tests. In 2003, the price of beef collapsed, and a quarter of the smaller cow-calf operations in the southeastern part of the state folded inside 18 months. Wes did not fold. He had no debt. He had a paid-for well, and a paid-for house, and a paid-for herd. And he had been raised in a quiet way by a man who never bought anything he could not pay cash for. In 2008 came the harder test. The oil boom in the Permian Basin spread west into Eddy County, and oil and gas leasing agents started knocking on every rancher's door offering serious money for surface leases and for water rights. One company offered Wes $320,000 for the exclusive right to draw water from his well for industrial fracking use, for a term of 15 years. Wes drove over to Hudson's place on the evening he got the offer. Hudson was on the porch with a cup of coffee. Wes told him the number. Hudson did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "What does the ground tell you?" Wes said the ground told him that the aquifer would not survive industrial pumping. Hudson said, "Then there's your answer." Wes turned the offer down. The agent came back twice in the following 6 months, increasing the offer to $410,000 and then to $475,000. Wes turned both increases down. The agent eventually moved on to a neighboring parcel whose owner accepted the deal. And within 4 years, that neighbor's well had collapsed from overdraft, and the neighbor's cattle had been sold off, and the parcel had been put up for sale at a loss. Hudson Lindquist died in February of 2009 at the age of 72. Of a heart attack in his own kitchen. He was found by Wes the next morning. He had left a will, dated 2 years earlier, leaving the home ranch and everything on it, 1,100 acres, the herd, the equipment, the house, to Wes Kane. There was no surprise about this in Eddy County. There was no contest. Wes did not speak at the funeral. He sat in the second row of the small Lutheran church on Key Avenue in Artesia with a young Hispanic woman from town named Renata Salazar, whom he had married 2 years earlier and who was a fourth-grade teacher at the elementary school. After the burial, he drove back out to the ranch and stood for a long while beside the windmill, and he laid his right hand on the cold steel of the casing, the same way he had laid it on a different casing in the spring of 1986. And he stood there for about 3 minutes. Then he walked into the house to make coffee, because that was the kind of thing you did. Educational note: the Permian Basin oil boom of the late 2000s triggered a wave of water rights speculation across southeastern New Mexico and West Texas. Hydraulic fracturing requires enormous volumes of water, frequently between 2 and 10 million gallons per well, and operators offered ranchers significant sums for short-term water leases. Many ranchers who accepted these offers later discovered that the heavy industrial pumping had damaged or destroyed the long-term recharge capacity of their wells, leaving them with degraded land and exhausted aquifers. Part 4. The Auction. 40 years later. Let me tell you about a morning in April of 2024, because that is the morning the whole shape of this story finally became visible to everybody in Eddy County who had any business looking at it. There was a ranch foreclosure auction north of Artesia on the property that everyone still called the old Tadlock Reeves place. It was 3,040 acres of irrigated pasture between Artesia and Lake Arthur, with 5 modern deep-bore wells, 2 center pivot irrigation systems, and a 4-bedroom ranch house with a swimming pool. The operation had been built in the mid-90s by a partnership led by a regional banker named Orville Tadlock, on the explicit theory that the future of southwestern ranching lay in heavy capital and aggressive groundwater extraction. The partnership had borrowed $12 million to build it, but the wells had been drilled too deep and pumped too hard. By the spring of 2024, the operation could not service its debt. The bank had foreclosed. Orville Tadlock was 82 years old. He had spent 40 years refusing loan applications from small ranchers he considered economically unserious, and telling people at the country club in Carlsbad that the future of New Mexico ranching belonged to capitalized operators, and not to the windmill and baling wire crowd. He had been one of the loudest voices, back in 1985, in the story that circulated through the bank lobby about how Hudson Lindquist had thrown $4,200 away on a dead piece of ground and given it to a drifter from Roswell. Tadlock had told that story for almost a decade as a parable of foolishness. He had stopped telling it sometime in the late 90s, when the punchline stopped quite working. Tadlock came to the auction wearing a pressed denim shirt and a new pale Stetson open road, sitting near the front of the cream-colored canvas tent with 3 younger men, investors from Midland and Lubbock. They were there to acquire the property at a discount and re-engineer the water strategy with new horizontal wells. About 60 people were inside the tent, holding numbered cardboard bidding paddles. The auctioneer, Ray Halloran, in a gray resistal and a black string tie, stood at a wooden podium. Wes Kane came in alone, 15 minutes before the bidding opened. He was 55 years old now. His hair had gone gray at the temples. He wore the same kind of patched dark wool work coat he had been wearing since the mid-90s, with a darker square of patch wool on the left elbow, where the old wool had given out 2 winters earlier. He wore Carhartt work pants with caliche dust at the cuffs, and a pair of cracked Red Wing boots. He took a folded paddle from the registration table, walked to the back aisle of the tent, and stood there. Orville Tadlock turned around in his chair when Wes came in. The 3 investors with him followed his gaze. One of them smiled and said something behind his hand, and another looked at Wes and quietly laughed. Tadlock did not laugh. Tadlock had gone very still. The auctioneer opened the bidding at $1,200,000. The number climbed past $1,000,005, past $1,000,008, past $2,000,001. At $2,000,004, a corporate operator out of Roswell dropped out. At $2,000,007, Tadlock's investors conferred, and one of them raised the paddle at $2,000,009. Wes Kane from the back aisle raised his paddle. $3,000,001, he said, loud enough to carry to the podium. The tent went very quiet. The Tadlock group conferred again. Tadlock was looking at Wes Kane at the back of the tent. After almost a full minute, Tadlock shook his head once, and the investor put down his paddle. The auctioneer called the bid 3 times and brought the gavel down. Wes Kane walked up the center aisle in his patch coat. He signed the contract at the registration table. He wrote a cashier's check, drawn on First National Bank of Artesia, for $3,100,000. He folded the deed into the inside pocket of his coat, the same way Hudson Lindquist had folded a receipt into a coat pocket on a November morning in 1985. Then he turned and walked, not out of the tent, but along the side wall to where a young man was standing alone against the canvas. The young man was 20 years old. His name was Alvaro Beltran. He was the son of one of Wes Kane's two full-time hands, Hector Beltran, who had been working for Wes for 16 years. Alvaro had grown up on Wes's ranch from the age of 4 and had been running the windmill maintenance on the outlying wells since he was 15. He had the same quality of attentiveness Wes had recognized in himself, the kind that had made Hudson Lindquist stop and notice him in 1985. Wes reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was a quitclaim deed, already signed and notarized 2 weeks earlier, conveying 160 acres of the original Holtkamp parcel, the southwest half, the half with the rebuilt air motor, and the 72-foot well, from Wes Kane to Alvaro Beltran. Wes held the folded deed out to Alvaro. Alvaro looked at the paper. He looked at Wes. He said, "What is this?" Wes said, "The Holtkamp parcel, the half with the well." Alvaro said, "Why are you giving this to me?" Wes said, "Because you're going to need it." Alvaro said he could not pay for it, and Wes said he knew that. And Alvaro said he did not understand, and Wes said, "You will." That was the entire conversation. Orville Tadlock had stood up from his chair and turned around to watch. He was about 30 feet away, close enough to hear every word. He did not say anything. He stood there for a long moment with his hands at his sides, and then he sat back down very slowly. And he did not look at his investors, and his investors did not look at him. Now let me tell you one last thing, because it is the thing this story is really about. Hudson Lindquist had understood something about legacy that the conventional measure misses. It does not travel only through blood. It travels through attention, through the willingness to see something in a person that the person cannot yet see in themselves, to hand them the tool that makes the seeing real, and to ask nothing back except that they do the same thing themselves when the time comes. The old air motor windmill on the southwest half of the Holtkamp parcel is 77 years old now. It is still running. It pulls cold, clean water at 38 gallons a minute. It belongs now to a 20-year-old boy who stood under it the morning after the auction and laid his right hand flat on the cold, galvanized steel of the casing, the same way Wes Kane had laid his hand on a different casing in May of 1986. On the drive home, Wes Kane's wife asked him what he had been thinking the whole time he stood in the back aisle of that tent. Wes was quiet for almost a mile. Then he said, "I was thinking the ground doesn't lie to you. It tells you everything it knows. You just have to be the kind of person who's willing to listen." That is the thing. That is the whole thing. Educational note. Across the American Southwest, the practice of mentorship through asset transfer, Quasenrefers, older landowners passing wells, water rights, or grazing leases to unrelated younger people they have trained, has historically been one of the quiet engines of continuity in ranching communities. Such transfers rarely appear in agricultural statistics because they do not move through families or markets, but through individual relationships built over years of shared work. Communities that have retained this tradition tend to preserve smaller, more resilient operations alongside large industrial ones.